Welcome to our webinar on negotiating or renegotiating the dental office lease. My name is Mitchell Braunstein. I'm with a company called Cirrus Consulting Group, and I will be leading today's program. And again, of course, it's on the topic of maximizing your leverage and negotiating the terms within your dental office lease in and throughout the state of Texas. So thank you all for joining. Over the next 50 minutes to an hour, we'll cover a wide variety of information, all applicable to dental practice owners or future dental practice owners. So whether you are starting up a new practice, renewing your office lease, expanding your practice space, or potentially selling and transitioning from ownership sometime within the next 10 years, all of the presented information will be applicable to you. Even if you perhaps own your own property and you just want to learn more about how to structure the lease between the holding company that would own the building and the corporation that the practice is registered under, today's program is going to be very insightful. Please do keep in mind that a CE credit, a continuing education credit, will be sent to the registered email with the doctor within the next 10 days from presentation. And we do have a poll. It's a marketing poll. It just helps us track some good information for our marketing department. So if you please don't mind answering a number of the questions that are just being asked in the introductory poll to the course. And then once that's completed, I believe there's 1 to 4 questions there. 1 being the purpose of joining the course today. 2, perhaps what your current situation is. 3 is when does your lease expire if you have a lease in place today. And 4, if you'd like a lease review, which includes a rental rate analysis. But perfect, with that in mind, let's get started. So for all of you, perhaps making a couple of statistical notes, please keep these numbers in mind. I do find it interesting, but just as we gather some data from clients and the different doctors and associations that we work with, both across Canada and the United States, we've come to realize that 85% of dentists have a lease that they have signed that could potentially prevent them from selling their practice at some point in the future. 54% of dentists across North America are overpaying in rent, whether that be due to poor negotiating skills or due to a landlord just trying to achieve a higher rental rate sought after by a high net worth tenant. And thirdly, 80% of landlords do structure their leases to give them at least 50% of the practice proceeds when a practice is sold. And we'll get into that in the details throughout the course, but usually it's determined based on the leasehold's improvement ownership. Before we do dive into some more of the technical material of the course, I wanted to provide some more information on myself as well as our company. So just a slide here about Cirrus Consulting Group. We are a healthcare and dental specialized tenant representation firm. We do also work with some landlords who are looking for lease creation services. But our company was founded by dentists for dentists in 1994. Since the inception of our firm, we've represented and negotiated over 12,000 dental and medical office leases. We in-house have a legal and leasing and consulting department. I'm a senior consultant, so a member of our consulting team. Annually, we represent between 500 to 700 clients or doctors throughout Canada and the US. And we deliver 100 plus continuing education courses or seminars annually. Again, typically they would all be in-person live seminar presentations at a conference center. But due to the nature of travel restrictions, et cetera, we are delivering a lot more online courses. And we typically would lecture at most of the major dental conventions, such as the Greater New York Dental Meeting, the Yankee Dental Conference, the CDA, etc. And we have worked with clients outside of North America and the UK and Australia as well. So again, the purpose of today's webinar is really to look at, first and foremost, the Texas market trends and updates. It has been a very successful state, and its commercial real estate market is doing quite well. So we'll get into that shortly. 7 financial negotiables within your office lease to consider if you're about to embark upon negotiations with your landlord. How to maximize your leverage as a tenant. The key terms and conditions within your office lease agreement. Please keep in mind, your office lease is not just summarized within the first 1 or 2 pages that outline the rent rates, but there are a number of terms that you need to keep in mind that could pose some issues to the practice. The tenant lease cycle and the timing for taking advantage of a lot of that tenant leverage. And then just some practical advice on negotiating your lease agreement. So whether you have an ongoing negotiation now or one coming up in the future, you're just going to better equip yourself for that upcoming project and task. So first and foremost, those market updates throughout the state of Texas. I pulled a quick report before the seminar as I was preparing for the presentation, and I wanted to take a quick peek at Houston. So this report that you see on the screen here, it's outlining all of the active vacancies and transactions. So property that's available for lease or sale within the Houston market. It's all designated retail in that asset class of retail properties. And it's up to 2,500 square feet of space. So as you can see, there's a wild amount of inventory right now available on the market. And that's because there's been a high degree of turnover for retail, not just retail, but office as well. So there's a lot of landlords out there right now who are actively trying to be very aggressive and offer good deals to tenants and lease out some vacant space. So there's a very high degree of vacancies. And with that high degree of vacancies, that increase in vacancy numbers, we do see a plateau or a decrease in the asking rental rates. But Houston, of course, has no shortage right now of retail vacancies. Just that screen grab of Dallas-Fort Worth, that submarket. Again, it's retail space available for lease with space between 0 to 2,500 square feet. So again, a very high degree of space that's available for lease. And this report does also pull advertisings from landlords or developers that are looking to design, build new properties. So you can see there in Mesquite, where we do have a couple of active client files right now, actually. You've got a landlord who has some land, they're looking to build out new retail space, and they've advertised it and we've picked up on the listing. But it's just key and critical information. So if we're representing a client in the immediate area, then we know what's available in the market and we know what is a fair and reasonable rental rate. Thirdly, I have the screen grab of the Austin submarket. So again, a very high degree of properties that are being advertised available for lease, all with the same metrics there. Retail space, that asset class, as well as that cap of 2,500 square feet. So again, it could be properties that are either vacant right now, or if there's a lease expiry coming up, a landlord is listing it online available for lease. And some tenants perhaps aren't even aware that the landlord is trying to attract new offers from new tenants that perhaps would be willing to pay more in rent, or would just provide the landlord with more security if they're worried of that retail tenancy going out of business, perhaps. Finally, we have San Antonio. Again, a very high degree of active listings right now, and landlords trying to fill a lot of space. So that's just a quick summary of obviously 4 of the many submarkets within Texas, but it's good to keep in mind. So if you're embarking on a negotiation with your landlord, or you're thinking of opening up a new or a second location, that you keep in mind, it's very important to collect the data and the information for what's available in the market. So if you're looking to open a new practice in Lubbock or Mesquite, that you equip yourself with that information and you make yourself very well aware of, okay, what is the going rental rate? If it's an office property that I want to have my orthodontic practice in. Great, well, what is the average asking rental rate for an office property in your specific submarket? So we pride ourselves on having a very good collection, both subscribing to a lot of the different broker networks. So we know all of the information that's available to a local broker, as well as our own historical data. And we have a lot of clients throughout the state of Texas, not to mention the country alone. So it's good just to have that information online. So if we are representing a new client, then we can reference some just, again, historical data to determine this is a fair rental rate. And if we want to be aggressive, well, of course, a lowball offer, et cetera, is warranted, but just very important to do your research before negotiating with a landlord or a new prospective landlord and determine what is the fair market rent rate that I'm trying to negotiate for. I did want to take a quick second because the last webinar presentation that I delivered, there were quite a few registrants who had connected with me afterwards, which of course is an option. If anyone wants to connect with questions or for a lease review, by all means, my information will be displayed at the end of the course. But a lot of the registrants had outlined that they actually own their property. So I have this screen here and it's supposed to just outline some quick, tangible differences between leasing versus buying. So if perhaps you are thinking of expanding your practice portfolio or your property portfolio, that you keep these points in mind just when you're going through the pros and cons. So let's first look at the what's required to buy a property if you're starting up a new practice. It will require a large upfront financial investment, right? That down payment for property alone can be well more than what an annual's rent rate is worth. Becoming a landlord is, for a lot of people, a full-time job. That's a whole new gambit. And if you're wearing the hat of being a practice owner, and now you want to wear the hat of being a property owner just to prepare yourself for that extra workload, it can be a great opportunity to earn some rental income, whether it be through your practice corporation, paying your property holding company rent, or if you have a multi-tenanted, multi-unit building and you're able to collect rent. It can be a great way to build equity and service some debt for the practice. It does give you some flexibility on how to use the space. If in the future you plan on renting the unit out, or if in the future you want to grow the practice, you don't have to ask a landlord to expand your office space. You can ask yourself. And there is a freedom to control the property, right? So if you have a timeline in mind for when you want to sell that asset, sell that property, and collect on the hopeful gains that you would have achieved, you can determine when you would like to sell that. Right, stepping into the other side of the screen, right, the leasing perspective. For those of you who are cash flow conscious, leasing property to start up a new practice requires a much smaller upfront payment. So it's not as difficult to go to the bank and ask for such a great loan. So it does help the cash flow. Secondly, it provides you with greater working capital to put towards building out the practice space, to put towards marketing, to put towards hiring a great office manager, to do all of the other things that perhaps will allow you to grow the practice and make it a success. So please keep in mind, it's not money lost, but perhaps just money that can be reallocated towards a different use if it's not for a property. And for those of you who are about to sign a lease or renew a lease, depending on the term commitment, it can give you flexibility to relocate, right? If you own a building and you have your practice located at your property, well, you're very much married to that location. But if you have a lease agreement in place and it provides you with flexibility to relocate, then you can take advantage of that. So let's dive into what is in a lease contract. Again, majority of the focus is for those of us who rent office space, but if you own property as well, just keep in mind you can be on both sides of the table as a practice owning tenant and a property owner. But a lease agreement, it is a very, very large financial commitment. Outside of the purchase of your home, it could be the second largest financial decision, if not the largest financial decision that you make throughout your entire career. A lot of people assume that the price tag on equipment will far outweigh the monthly rental rate that you pay the landlord at the end of your 30-day cycle. But when you tally up that rent payment made over the course of your career, whether it be a 25, 30, 35-year career, all of that rent tallied up is going to well surpass that $1 million mark. So do keep in mind that the lease agreement is not just a very large financial commitment on a monthly basis, but that money is going to pay someone else's mortgage. And you just need to be sure that it's an agreement that you're not leaving your practice at risk in. And beyond the rent commitment, it can pose a lot of different legal liabilities. So we need to be sure we understand what it is that we're signing and what it is that we're committing to beyond the rent dollars. So why is the office lease agreement so important? And not just important in general, but so important throughout the year of COVID-19 and the crazy past, what is it now, 14, 15 months that we've all had. So did you make alterations to your space? Did you receive any kind of rent deferral or rent relief or rent abatement throughout the past, again, 12 to 14 months? Your office location is the foundation of your practice, right? You as a practice owner, you have a brick and mortar business that people have to go to. Dentistry is not a traveling business. You're not putting your practice on wheels. So keep in mind that the practice location, even if it is rented, really is the foundation for your business. And if you don't have a properly set up leasing document, a lease agreement, it can be like a shaky foundation on your house. So you just need to be sure it's set up properly. The investment it takes to build out a new office space is anywhere between $100 to $200 a foot. By the time you factor in all of the expenses for the plumbing, the electrical, the permitting, the design, and right down to the last sheet of drywall, it is a very expensive build out process. So we just need to be sure if there's any chance for us to receive some kind of security that those leasehold improvement values can be sold to the buyer in the future, then fantastic. So let's just be sure that we are signing something with a degree of security for not just yourself as the practice owner, but for the successor, for the person that you're going to sell the practice to, because they will be looking at this lease, undoubtedly. It is very difficult and expensive and time consuming to go through a relocation. For those of you who have done that, for those of you on the program today who have actually had to go through a relocation, you would be obviously very familiar with just the major headache that would have posed to you in the practice. It's not just the new build out expense that you have to take on, right? Paying for that second location to be built out, but it's also the downtime that the practice has. If your current location has its doors closed and you cannot be billing your patients because the new location is being built out and the doors aren't ready to be opened there, you'll have a loss in revenue. So there's a lot of loss there. And typically for every quarter mile that you relocate the practice, you lose 5% of your patient roster. So keep that in mind. There's a number of different ways beyond the build out that you'll have some patient attrition or just loss in practice production in that relocation. Your practice sale, if you have a poorly negotiated office lease, if it's missing a few of those key and critical business terms, it can really affect you when you're looking to sell the practice. We'll get into a number of those different provisions. So very tangible examples that I have in a few of the following slides, but it can really be a danger if you're looking to sell the practice. The lease agreement can be a huge problem if it's not properly set up today. And the lease finally is something that should give you leverage, right? If it is a properly set up foundation for the practice, it should give you more of a stronger point of leverage to either negotiate with your current landlord or to sell the asset, sell the business that you have, sell that practice and recapture some value. All that time and energy and effort that you've put into growing your practice. So let's discuss 7 of the financial negotiables within your office lease. And again, this is applicable if you're looking to lease new space, if you're considering renewing your office lease and you're hoping to negotiate with your current landlord, or if you're going through an expansion or a practice sale and transition. But the first thing that we can negotiate always is that base rent commitment. In 90% of the commercial office leases, you'll have a triple net lease design where you have your base rent commitment, and then on top of that, your triple net charges, you have your taxes, your maintenance and insurances. But always the first thing that we should try to negotiate is that base rent commitment. And most landlords, if not all landlords, will try to gradually increase that annual rent rate, that base rate, by 50 cents, by $1. It depends what they're proposing, but we have to try to negotiate that base rent commitment. The annual increase, as I just mentioned, is something that we can negotiate or defer. But to keep that in mind, if you have a renewal or a new lease proposal that you're working on. The common area maintenance charges. A lot of landlords, if they're looking to make a major capital improvement to a property, replace the roof, repave the parking area, replace and fix a lot of those HVAC systems that would have been damaged in the storm a couple of months ago. A lot of the time, a landlord will try to levy those property expenses to their tenants through those common area maintenance charges, those additional maintenance costs that a lot of us receive on a monthly basis. If we have a fixturing, a build out period that we're about to undertake to build out new space, let's be sure that we're not paying rent during that period when we're building out the office space. Because if you can't operate, if you can't see patients while the space is being refurbished, if it's being renovated, if it's being built out for the first time, well, then you can't generate revenue and you don't have money to pay rent. So you should absolutely not be paying rent during the months of that fixturing period or that build out period. That leads me to the free rent period. If the average practice timeline to be built out is between 4 to 6 months, right? Why don't we negotiate for up to 7 or 8 months worth of free rent in case there's any kind of construction delay? But a free rent period can save you months worth of that monthly rent commitment. The tenant improvement allowance, and I just want to take 2 minutes to clarify something because a lot of people are under the impression that a tenant improvement allowance is cash upfront from a landlord that you never have to pay back. And it's just to be used for the fixturing period or that build out expense. But really, a smart landlord will offer a tenant improvement allowance, that cash incentive, to be used on fixing the space or retrofitting it, but they'll always recapture that loan plus interest throughout the life of the lease term. So that base rental rate will include for the expense of that tenant improvement allowance if the landlord is offering it to you. If you elect to take that, sometimes it might even make more sense to go and borrow money from the bank because it's so cheap right now and interest rates are so cheap. But it is not just free cash up front. A landlord's work, right? Their commitment to helping you get your business started, they're going to benefit with more foot traffic coming to the property. If the landlord is willing to contribute any kind of work to the property itself, it's just important that we have that outlined in writing. So how to maximize your leverage as a very specific type of tenant, whether you're in an office property, whether you're in a healthcare building, whether you're in a retail setting, how are you going to maximize your leverage as a practice owning dentist, right? Consider this, consider that you are actually the best tenant on the planet. If I have a building and I'm trying to rent it to anybody, I'm going to go after a dentist. I would prefer to rent it to a dentist. And there's a number of different reasons why. Firstly, let's consider the term commitment. A dentist is not opening up a new practice to try to relocate their business in 6 months or 2 years or 5 years' time. Most dentists build out their office space and they commit to 10 years term plus options to renew. That's fantastic for me as a landlord because now I have a very long-term commitment and I know I'll be able to service my mortgage debt for that very long term. Whereas compared to a restaurant tenant that has the highest degree of turnover or default percentage in comparison to any other tenant, it's much safer for me. I have a lot more security if I'm renting to a dentist. Very rarely do dentists default on their lease commitments, and very rarely can they not make rent. They earn a good living, and it's just good for me as a landlord when I'm looking to achieve that security for a long term. It's very important too that you consider all of the money and effort in building out the office space. That actually becomes property of the landlord. So it benefits the building owner because now they have space that has been improved upon, and they're just going to maintain that equity in the building, that improvement in the leaseholds. So very important just to consider that. And again, if you're ever forced with a relocation, you need to think, oh my gosh, the landlord is actually the one who's going to be keeping all of those improvements, and now I'm forced to leave. But just to remember that the long-term commitment, the good rental rates, the high foot traffic, the very low degree of turnover are all good things for a landlord. So really it can be a win-win situation. If they have a great location and you have a good lease agreement, there's no need for anyone to lose in the scenario of renting from a landlord. What are the 3 key sellable components of your practice? And this is important to consider as it ties into the lease agreement. But just to break it down into a simple graph, I wanted to outline what are the 3 key components of your practice from an appraiser's perspective when you're looking to sell the business. So first, we have the value of the equipment. That's something that you can sell to a buyer. Second, you have the goodwill, the patient charts, really the thing that determines your revenue for the business. And thirdly, you have the real estate. The real estate can affect as much as 100% of what your practice's overall value is. And when you're looking to list your business with a practice broker and it's time for retirement, the 3 main elements that will determine your practice's value is the equipment, the patient charts, and the lease agreement if it's property that you're renting. The agreement of purchase and sale, when you're going through that process of selling the practice, will always be conditional on a review and transfer of the office lease. But the difficult reality is, if you're not able to actually transfer the office lease, all you're left with is only being able to sell the goodwill and the equipment. And now what you've done is just taken your overall practice value and chopped it in half, because most people are trying to perform an asset sale, which involves a transfer of the office lease. It involves a transfer of that value of real estate to the buyer. If you are looking to perhaps purchase a new practice and you love the location of where this practice is, but you can't assume the lease agreement from the selling doctor, you're only left with being able to buy one of these 2 things, not the whole practice value, which includes the lease document. So what should the lease agreement do for you? I hope I perhaps caught some of you while you're eating lunch just to pay attention, because of course this is something that is important for a lot of us that own their practice. So what should your lease agreement do for you? It needs to provide you with fair and affordable financial terms. It should also provide you with that long-term stability and security. It should minimize your personal and professional risk and exposure. It needs to maximize your flexibility and enhance your ability to eventually sell the practice. I just want to spend some time discussing the ability for some flexibility in your currently rented office space. If you ever had goals of potentially expanding your office space and building out a 5th or 6th operatory, or potentially even buying the building that you're renting in today, one way that you can include for some flexibility is to have what's known as a right of first refusal. And depending on how it's drafted, it can actually give the tenant one of 2 options. Option 1 being the ability to expand to the adjacent office space if it's available for lease before the landlord would advertise it to anyone else or put it on the market. Or if the landlord were electing to sell the property before putting it on the market, they would have to offer it to you to purchase before anyone else. And it's a good flexible term to have if you have the goal of one day trying to own the property, expand the office square footage, or it's another valuable thing to have if you're looking to sell the practice and transfer that clause to a buyer, because a lot of DSOs, a lot of practice owners are very eagerly trying to include for flexible options themselves. So what's in your lease agreement? Let's consider a few of the actual term clauses that may be in your lease agreement today. And I copy and pasted this language. It's an option to renew clause, but I have changed the name of the tenant. So Dr. Joe Black is just, it's an alias, if you will. That's not a real doctor, just for confidentiality purposes from the lease that I copied this from. I took out the actual named tenant. But this is an option to renew clause, and it's found in over 90% of commercial office lease documents. And it essentially allows for the tenant to extend the term or extend the life of the lease agreement. So there's a couple of issues with this copy and pasted option to renew clause that may be very similar to what you have in your lease agreement today. So if you just take 2 minutes to read through this as an exercise, we can determine if perhaps you can notice any potential issues. So I'll let everyone read through this for a second. Okay, and now we'll see if anyone was able to catch a couple of the inherent issues. So these highlights here, and I'll read through them, pose some problems to the practice owner. It says, provided that Dr. Joe Black shall remain as the tenant, and if the tenant duly and has regularly paid its rent and has performed its covenants and obligations under this lease and has not been in default, right, there's a problem. So if Dr. Joe Black, meaning that this option to renew is personally tied to the current tenant, right? But if someone is trying to buy my practice and I only have 1 year left on my current term and the options to renew are in my personal name and I can't transfer them to the buyer, it's going to be a big issue, because when the buyer goes to the bank to ask for a loan, the amortization period of that loan will be built around the term of the lease document. But if there's only 1 year left of lease term, transferable lease term, and the options to renew will not apply for the buyer's sake, for their financing conditions, it's going to be a problem, because now that buyer will have a big issue getting approved for any kind of loan to be able to afford the practice purchase. And then what has happened to the ability of the selling doctor? They've lost their buyer because now they can't afford to buy the practice. So better it would be if the option to renew were structured in such a way that it could be transferred to somebody else. Or if the lease agreement were in a professional corporation as the tenant instead of this doctor personally, so that those options to renew could be transferred to the buyer of that corporation. Secondly, if the tenant were in default at any time, the options to renew would not apply to that doctor if they're looking to transfer the lease, if they're looking to extend the life of the lease term and exercise their options to renew. It also says that any such renewal shall be on the landlord's then current standard form lease. That means that if the doctor's hoping to renew their office lease, that it's going to have to be on the landlord's standard form. And what does standard form? Quite simply, if this standard form is not defined, it can mean whatever the landlord wants. They can change the rent rates. They can do a whole number of things. But allowing for the landlord just to change the true commitment of the rental agreement at a time of option to renew is a very inherent problem. Of course, it outlines that in no event shall it be less than the rent paid in the last year of the original term. If the economy goes down and the fair market rental rate is less than what it is today, this landlord is playing defense. He's being sure, or he or she is being sure, that they always collect more in rent for the option to renew, but it should be in fact tied to the consumer price index. And then finally, it says based on the market rent for the renewing tenants in the building. Well, if a number of the tenants in the building are Starbucks or they're Class A retail or office tenants and they're paying a very high premium in rent, well, it's outlining here that for this option to renew, that tenant is going to have to pay what the other tenants are perhaps paying in rent. So the landlord has just created a very controlling option to renew, something that can be very detrimental to a practice owner. So let's just be sure our options to renew are more or less drafted in a tenant favorable term, and not something that's more controlling for the landlord. So secondly, the example I have here is particular for anyone who's considering selling their practice, but the assignment clause outlines a tenant's ability to actually transfer their office lease from themselves as the tenant today to the new incoming tenant. And this is very parallel to a doctor's ability to actually sell the practice. So if you recall just a few slides ago, when we mentioned that part of the practice's value is determined in the real estate, and if you can't transfer the office lease, it can reduce the practice value greatly, up to 50%, if not 100%, if you're not able to transfer the office lease. And that detail is often found in the assignment provision. So we'll just take a few seconds here to read through this clause. And again, as an exercise, just see if you can catch any of the inherent risks. Okay, so a whole number of issues, and we'll go through them quickly together. But the first reason that this assignment clause is problematic, it says that it shall receive the consent of the landlord. So if the tenant is trying to transfer the lease, they have to receive the landlord's consent. Well, if you can't receive the landlord's consent in a lease transfer, big problem for a practice sale. It also says that the landlord shall have the option to either 1, approve the tenant's request to assign the lease or sublet the premises, 2, decline the tenant's request to assign the lease or sublet the premises, or 3, terminate the lease agreement upon the effective date of such proposed lease assignment or sublet. Obviously, a couple of problems with those landlord options there. It also says the landlord shall have the right to revise the minimum rent to be paid during the remainder of the term to the greater of the then current market rent for the leased premises of 15% greater than the then current rent, should tenant receive from assignee or subtenant any rental income, cash, goods, or any form of consideration in connection with the lease assignment of this lease or sublet of the premises that is over and above the current base rental rate payable to landlord, etc. It's basically saying if there's any money received associated with the transfer of the lease, that the landlord shall be able to collect that. But obviously, when you're going through a practice sale and a lease transfer, you're going to be changing, a lot of money is going to be changing hands. And that language there is inherently problematic, because if it says the landlord can collect that, we absolutely do not want to have our retirement fund go directly to the hands of the property owner. So be sure that your lease agreement does not include that language. And then finally, it says that despite a lease transfer, the tenant shall not be released from its obligations under the lease and shall remain liable for any failure of the tenant or the assignees. So even if the lease transfer proceeds, the previous tenant, the person selling, will remain continuously liable and on the hook. So if the new doctor, if they can't run the practice like you and they can't make that monthly rental payment, the landlord has somebody to go after and collect money from. So that's a huge issue. We need to be sure to know that you're no longer held continuously liable, and that when you are able to retire and sell the business, that you are in fact retired and you're not worrying about any kind of responsibilities at that point in time. So be sure there's no continued liability. There's no landlord consideration language. There's no problematic landlord consent terms, and they don't have an option to terminate the lease. There's a number of clients that we have right now that are trying to go through the process of selling their practice, and one in particular who's an orthodontist in Phoenix who is going through the process of transferring his lease. And he had just received a notice from the landlord that the landlord wants to recapture the value of those leasehold improvements. So all of the money that was put into the office space to build out the leasehold improvements, the landlord is of the opinion and making the argument that no, they own those leasehold improvements. And if there's any value changing hands associated with the leaseholds, well, it's in fact their property. It's the landlord's property that the tenant is trying to sell. even though the tenant built it out. So just be very careful, because a lot of landlords, big and small, can be very difficult when it comes time to transfer the lease document. So a number of the other issues that could be within your office lease agreement, and I just have a list here. And in the interest of time, I didn't want to go through too many more exercises, but one that is very problematic for a very urban area that's going through a lot of redevelopment or construction is landlords will always try to include a demolition right? A landlord option to provide an eviction notice to tenants to demolish the building. If somebody's trying to repurpose their asset, if a landlord's trying to position their building for a sale to a developer, or if they're a developer themselves and they want to rebuild on that land, a demolition clause can be a huge issue, not just for the short term, not just for your practice's predictability, but again, when you're going to sell the practice to someone else, if there's a found demolition clause, any savvy buyer is going to realize, whether they're working with a group like ours or anyone else, that if there's the landlord ability to terminate the lease agreement and demolish a property, it's a huge issue for a business, any business, let alone a practice, a dental practice. So let's just be sure that no, there's no demolition right in your lease agreement, because it can hurt you in the short term and it can definitely hurt you in the long term. If you have a very large retail setting and you're a general dentist, let's try to get an exclusive covenant so that if there's any vacancy within the property, that the landlord doesn't try to rent space out to a competitor of yours. Or if you're in a big office building, if we can achieve that exclusivity provision just on the right side column, then it would just basically give you the right as the tenant to be sure that you don't have any unforeseen competition coming to the building. And again, a very valuable thing that you can position to the buyer of your practice. So just a whole long list of things here to keep in mind. But in the interest of time, I am going to move along. So I had mentioned that we discussed the tenant lease cycle, and I reached out to a couple of the registrants for the course today. And I know a couple of you had mentioned that your lease is coming up for renewal and expiry. And as I mentioned to one of the registrants, the best time always to actually begin the discussions, the negotiations with the landlord, is even as far as up to 24 months before the actual expiry. And that does a number of things. One, it gives you enough time to go through this process without a major headache. Two, is it actually makes the landlord concerned, because it doesn't take a rocket scientist to realize if a dental office were trying to relocate, you could very well do so within a 24-month time frame. By the time you go through the site selection, permitting, design, build out, that could take near 12 to 24 months. So if we discuss with the landlord the renewal options, they're ever motivated to come to terms with you in your renewal negotiation. So that's always the best thing to keep in mind. Is it's great for us to get the process started as far in advance as possible, even as much as 36 months in some cases. But if we have the shot clock winding down and there's only a couple of months or weeks left on the lease agreement, that it can hurt us in a number of ways. We can lose a lot of tenant leverage. So it's better for us. If we have more time, it's the higher degree of success that we have with the landlord, because you really are just stuck between a rock and a hard place if you've only got a couple of days left on the lease agreement. Before the actual expiry date, there's always an option to renew clause deadline. So if you have an option to renew, you will most likely have a deadline, whether it be 3 or 6 months before the actual expiry. So don't pass that deadline, because if you do, then you lose your option to renew. You lose that right. And that's more leverage in the negotiations on the landlord side. So just keep that in mind. So our strategy and tactics for a winning lease negotiation is really boiled down to 8 steps. But first and foremost, it's gathering all the necessary documentation, those original lease copies, the options to renew, amending agreements, assignments, assumptions, addendums, etc. just identifying what your true practice goals are. If you have a very immediate transition and retirement plan, we need to understand that so we can help you prepare for what the recommendations would be on negotiating with your landlord, really matching your real estate goals with your practice goals. 3, just reviewing the office lease and its risks, so determining where the potential pitfalls are. 4 is preparing the market research. So we went through a few of those market stats, but doing a really deep dive into what the market is proving, to just research and better prepare for what the proposed rental rates will be, et cetera. Crafting what the outcome and strategy will be. 6 is determining the lease negotiation economics. So really putting in those proposed rent rates into a finely tuned rent structure. The lease negotiation terms, so outlining again, what are the more important and appropriate terms, business terms within the office lease to address. And then 8, finally, is a final review and execution of the office lease, because we have had many times where we go back and forth with landlords or landlord representation, whether it be a lawyer or a leasing company, and they at the final hour of a negotiation will put in language that we've not seen before, and they just hope that a tenant will sign it, either an exhaustion of a long negotiation or just not catching it. But it's just very important that we always review what we're signing and really understand what it is that you're committing to with the landlord. Just wanted to share a couple of success stories. We've got a number of great clients that we're very proud to have worked with. But most recently, we received a very nice Google review, a 5-star Google review from a Dr. Christian Solom, who's been a client of ours for a very long negotiation process. But he just left us a very nice Google review, so I wanted to share that. And then Dr. Omera Naz, who is out in California, and we had actually helped her with a number of things, most notably save over $16,000 worth of relocation expenses. So very happy to have received that notice from Dr. Naz. Yeah, if you have a chance, check out, we've got over 200 5-star Google reviews. And then finally, I wanted to outline that we do have a lease review service. So for any of those of you on the course today who are hoping to receive a lease review, it's a service that we value at $1,995. Basically, it includes 3 to 4 hours of us analyzing your lease for traps within your current document and any amendments or riders or extensions that you might have signed. Then we just get on a quick scheduled call to cover what you and your vision or plan for the practice are, the traps that we would have uncovered, those risks within the office lease, what the ideal lease would look like for you, and how to negotiate an effective tactical plan. But that $2,000 service fee is essentially now being offered complimentary, thanks to the sponsorship from Henry Schein. So for any of those in attendance today who would like to receive a lease review, by all means, don't hesitate to contact me. That's my direct number. That's my office line there, the 800-459-3414 extension 3247. And my email as well, which is mbraunstein@cirrusconsultinggroup.com. And we'd be more than happy to schedule a complimentary lease for you. Just as we exit and I allow you back to go and see your patients, we do have another final poll. And I believe it's another 4 question poll. And it just asks, first, are you presently a tenant with a lease in place today? 2, do you know when your lease expires? If you failed to answer that question just at the beginning, or if you were a few minutes delayed in joining us for the webinar, perhaps now you'll have the chance just to answer when your current lease expires. Maybe you're month to month, and that's something that is very worrisome, but nonetheless, we can go through some options for you. Is your situation urgent? Maybe you only have a couple of weeks left until the expiry. And are you interested in a complimentary lease review? So myself or a colleague will happily reach out to you and schedule that appointment. If you are interested in that lease review, it does also include what the rent rate analysis is for your immediate submarket. So we can determine, are you overpaying in rent? Are you right in line with the market? Or perhaps are you underpaying? But more than happy, again, to connect with you, myself or a colleague will. And that's it. So just before we exit here, if there's any questions, I'll just allow for I guess, 2 minutes worth of a Q&A. And then you can all just go back and enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Someone just mentioned in the quick Q&A that they had received an estoppel certificate. And what is an estoppel? So an estoppel certificate basically indicates that the landlord is either trying to refinance or sell the property. So the bank would require basically a term summary from the landlord. And that would mean that the landlord has to get just a quick signature from the tenant saying, yes, they're tenants, they're happily renting space in this building and they've agreed to X amount of years for this amount of rent, et cetera. And it's just a process that someone would go through if they're trying to refinance the building. So pull out some equity and refinance the building, or if they're trying to sell the building and show the buyer just that act of good faith that yes, they have faithful tenants and et cetera. But it is a big indicator that the building is being sold. And just be sure that if you're about to sign that estoppel certificate, that the landlord hasn't included any additional amendments, any changes to that original lease. So just review that very carefully. And again, of course, if you want us to go through it with you, myself or a colleague, one of the other consultants will be happy to do so. Right, just finished a couple minutes early here, but I thank you all for joining us. Again, I'll just for the next few minutes leave our contact information up on the slide. And please enjoy the rest of your day and the rest of your week.